Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction and for this platform. I'm very happy and honored to be here. I think that, when we were talking about possible topics and you all suggested art, artist, and society. At one level, it's a very sort of a broad topic that sounds very sometimes, much done already. But the more I began to think about it, I began to realize that actually this is one of the most, at this point, sort of art, the role of the artist, and how the artist and what she does and what she creates and how that interacts with society has actually become, I think, one of the most fundamental areas of not just engagement, but conflict in our society today. And the more I began to think about why and how that happened, there a lot of sort of thoughts that have come to my mind, and I don't want to today speak as if this is a lecture or something like that. I mean, I think that I would prefer to make this seem more like I can present some of my musings on the topic, and then perhaps sort of also have some discussion and hear back from whoever's listening. I come from an industry, which is the film industry, which is one of the most popular art forms, one of the richest art forms. And when I say richest, I don't mean just in terms of revenue generation, but it's an art form that needs a lot of wealth to even create, and it's also a very powerful, very widely disseminated, viewed kind of art form. And my industry has a very sort of, one of the very prevalent views about itself as an art form is, and this is quoting a famous dialogue from a film that says that films are about entertainment, entertainment, entertainment. And I think that is also one view of looking at art, which is that art should be about entertainment, 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 and something that engages you, something that engages the audience, something that like makes the audience feel entertained, happy, good. And it's, in my mind, it is a very limiting view of art and what the potential of art is. But when I think about it in today's context, it's also a very safe view of art, and it is the kind of view that I think that people who are on the status quo side of power would actually feel very comfortable with. And this is something that you have seen from, I mean, time immemorial, from the time of, the older artists everywhere in the world, that wherever art has engaged with power in a way in which, where it needs the support of that power, where it needs the, where it needs, whether it's in terms of money, whether it's in terms of reach, whether it's in terms of, whatever, that art has always been actually quite safe, and it has, in some senses, I don't want to say bowed down to power, but it has sort of molded itself in a way that made it very palatable for power. And this is true for, supposing you were to talk about whether this was the Elizabethan poets, whether it was the court poets of even during India, in India, whether it was, whether it is the, sometimes now my film industry as well. But I think that actually speaking, what we see today is a far more interesting dynamic developing, which is that I for me, art is like a mirror. It will always reflect what is happening in society. And in that sense, when it's doing its jobs, it will lay bare the fault lines of the society we live in. That is true for even like that's actually true for all art forms. That is true for, say, painting, when it is MF Hussain sir and the kind of paintings that he made that created a crisis. That is true for literature, if there is a book, and I think that a few years ago we had this sort of a case with Perumal Muruganji and the book that he wrote and the kind of crisis that created. That is true for comedy, again, much contested art form in our currently in our time, and that is true for cinema and music and so many other things. But the point that I want to sort of make really is that I don't think that art can avoid its engagement with society. That's actually not possible. It ends up engaging with the society that it lives in, even when it tries not to. The question, I think, really, as artists and as people perhaps who are engaged in the world of art, the question we need to ask ourselves is that how does one become conscious of that, and how does one shape that? I'll give you two very small examples. One is this question of the fact that art will that society and what is happening in society will find its way into art. I just have two very basic examples to give about that. One, of course, is the is Bollywood. So I think that you will remember a few years ago there was this very controversial case in Kashmir where an army major, I think his name was Major Gogoi, had tied a shepherd and a Kashmiri man who later turned out to be a shepherd who was just grazing his cattle in the area onto the jeep of onto the army jeep as a human shield. And that image and that video became very viral, and there was a lot of controversy that it generated, because it started this whole debate about human rights, about like just in terms of what is okay as a tactic, what is okay as a self-defense tactic, about and it was actually a very shrill debate, because the whole right-wing ecosystem got into it, and then people started making t-shirts, and it just actually became quite disturbing to watch that. And a lot of sort of so-called thinkers of the right wing sort of commented on it, and it became this huge debate. 6 months later, I don't want to comment on on I don't want to at this moment comment on the right and wrong of that particular issue, but just to illustrate, 6 months later there was a film that was made, that was released in Bollywood, called Baghi 2. So completely out and out commercial film. It had Tiger Shroff and I can't remember who the actress was, and it was an action flick. That film had the exact same scene recreated, where Tiger Shroff's character plays an army officer or some kind of a spy or something to do with the army. And there is a scene in the film which actually recreates this whole human shield thing. And again, there was a lot of discussion around it. A lot of the reviews mentioned it. But my point is that I don't know how, I don't know whether the makers necessarily understood the implication of everything that they were doing, but they were clearly, consciously influenced by what was happening in the society around them, right? We've seen this in Bollywood with the way in which historicals have been made. It's actually, if you ask me, I find it quite shocking, because and Bollywood has had a history of making some great historicals, and we've come from a place where the historical was always sort of, in some sense, projecting the whole spirit of what we have now come to understand as Indian secularism, Indian syncretism, celebrating India's diversity, and a very I would say more progressive view of India's sort of medieval history. And if you think of Mughal-e-Azam, that comes to mind, or so many of the historicals after that, and I would say right down till Jodha Akbar, and even in some sense Baji Rao Mastani, which are, these were always, most of these historicals have been set in the Mughal or the medieval period, and all of them are very self-consciously sort of stuck by sort of the spirit of our preamble. And you suddenly see a break post 2014-15, where now if you watch Bollywood's historicals, they, and I'm saying this very I know I'm saying something quite sort of decisive, but I'm saying it deliberately. It really feels like now these historicals are being, it feels like they're being scripted in sort of the Nagpur headquarters of the RSS. Because if you look at what is happening with historicals in Bollywood, it is actually beginning to function as a mouthpiece for the RSS's project of rewriting Indian medieval history to suit their ideological agenda. These are two examples that have, in the most recent time, in my mind, that relate to how what happens in society sort of influences art, and even an art form that is as vast and powerful as film. I'm not so familiar with the South industry and everything that has happened there, but I did watch Bahubali, and I enjoyed it very much. And I did notice the sort of little sort of very cleverly put reference to Jallikattu that Bahubali 2 had, literally in one small shot in a montage scene. But I found that very interesting because that was the time that the whole Jallikattu protests were happening in Tamil Nadu. And I was very struck by how the filmmaker was trying to sort of, in some, I don't know if he was trying to capitalize, but how he was trying to sort of kind of catch the moment and the spirit of the moment, and it was very clearly in the film, also very clearly he had taken a very pro Jallikattu sort of stand. And I found that very interesting because it was, it needn't have been there at all. But I thought that was an interesting choice. I think that there is no point denying anymore that we live in a time when we live in a very conflicted time. We are ruled by a party that and a government that has made no bones about the kind of ideological agenda that it is pushing, even if that ideological agenda is actually against the spirit of the Indian Constitution. And you've seen that repeatedly with whether it was with the CA-NRC sort of whole project and everything that happened with that, whether it was with the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir, or whether it has now been with the introduction of these new farm laws. All of them are now, all these three things are now, and decisions of the government are now pending sort of in court. Like all of them, those decisions went to Supreme Court as being, unconstitutional, some of them illegal. Why I'm bringing this up is because you can see, and I don't want to pretend like this was the only government that tried to sort of keep an eye on what is going on in the world of art. That is not true at all. India has had a history of censorship from the time that we became an independent country, and it's very unfortunate because as we all know, those censorship laws are actually they were drafted and they come from the colonial Indian Penal Code, the British Indian Penal Code. So you can understand why a colonizing nation would want that kind of law in place. It's very unfortunate that a newly independent nation chose to sort of, carry that legacy of censorship forward. So I don't want to act like this is the only time that censorship and control of art have taken place. But what is interesting is really the timing of what is happening today. Because on the one hand, you have a government that is very avowedly ideological, which is in power. It has a lot of power because it is in power with a huge mandate. And it's a government that does not care about institutions and processes and due processes of law or constitutional provisions, quite frankly, right? at the same time, you have the artist. And I'm speaking very generally. We can discuss this a little more. I'll wrap up soon now. At the very same time, you have, and I'm speaking literally about the 21st century, this decade that we are living in. You have the artist who finds herself suddenly in the limelight a lot more, because suddenly, without her necessarily realizing even, she has, because of the way in which technology has developed, she suddenly has a reach that is much wider than she has ever had in history. What technology has done, and when I say technology, I am talking about social media, I'm talking about Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, especially YouTube, what it has, and all the other allied sort of platforms, the iPhone, literally the fact that this phone that has for the longest time been like just an instrument of communication now is an instrument of creation. The camera that this phone has, the very act of clicking a selfie, now one could argue, theoretically speaking, makes everyone an artist. Everyone suddenly has the potential to click a picture, put a filter, put some effects, write a comment, and advertise it on social media. So suddenly the artist finds herself with so many more means at her disposal to create, with so much more reach to get that art across. And sometimes that reach has actually is something not in her control. So when you look at the whole idea of things going viral, it's very interesting, because actually, and I think this was something that Roland Barthes said, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that when he talks about how once the work of art has gone into the public, there is an independent play with the audience that the artist or the writer or the creator has no control over. And you see that most I think clearly, and it's in a most illustrative manner in the whole phenomena of things going viral. Because while that's great and it shows the power of the artist thanks to technology, it also shows the vulnerability of the artist. Because what has happened repeatedly, and I'm going to again illustrate that with an example, is that once that thing goes viral, the artist actually has no control over interpretation. We live in a society that is so deeply polarized, that is so deeply sort of hostile, a public discourse that is so sort of conflicted and polarized, and a society where there is an embedded ideological agenda that those people who are in power have. So why I'm saying that actually this topic is very interesting to look at today is that the confluence of all these things, of the technology we now have, the time we live in, the reach we have, the kind of connection that we have, the fact that we have a government that has had such a huge mandate and is in power, that it's a government that has a very that has a very sort of clear ideological agenda that it makes no bones about. All this sort of has created a very, I think, interesting for us to look at and study kind of situation when it comes to art and the artist and society. If you look back in the last 3 to 5 years, I would say actually up to 5 years, the number of writers, artists, comics, fewer actors that have gotten into actual legal trouble, whether it is in the form of arrests or litigation or demands for arrest with the law enforcement agencies of our country, it is quite shocking. Even as we speak, there is a comic based out of a comic from Gujarat who was arrested in Indore in about 10 days ago, I think, for allegedly making fun of Hindu gods and of the Home Minister. It's a very interesting case, because if you look at, forget the most obvious aspects of that case, that the man is Muslim and he's being harassed. Forget that for a minute. just to look at what happened. This boy was doing a set. He was making jokes about 2002. I've actually seen that set in a different place, not in Indore, obviously. There was a BJP MLA's son sitting in the audience who got very uncomfortable with the kind of comments he was making. He went onto stage, and there is actually a video of this argument between the artist and somebody who symbolizes power and being in power. And what happens after that is that a complaint is filed, the police is called, and the artist and all his team are arrested. It's now been more than 10 days. He hasn't had bail. And the statement of the Indore SP is very, very telling. He says that while we have no evidence that what that artist was doing on stage or what he was saying was either hurting any religious sentiments, he did not make fun of Hindu gods, he did not make any comments that were, from a legal standpoint, criminally sort of liable in any way. But we know that he was going to. It's very interesting because it actually reveals the very, very deep sort of insecurity that power feels when it is confronted with art and with an artist who is using his or her art form to actively engage with the world that he lives in. Munawar Farooqui is being illegally confined. He is in jail in a manner that is actually unconstitutional. It is illegal. It is something that should actually worry all of us very, very deeply. But it also shines a light in a way at something very interesting, which is that the more our power structures and our power centers try to become all-powerful, omnipresent, and they are now omnipresent because of surveillance, because of total lack of privacy. I mean, I don't want to get into that whole debate about WhatsApp chats, how they leak, all that. That's a whole separate, I think, topic for Manthan's another sort of conversation. But it shows us something very interesting, that the more powerful the institutions try to become, the more they try to consolidate their power and control society, not just in our actions by law and by rules and so on, but try to control our thought. Pratap Bhanu Mehta has a very interesting term that he uses, and he's spoken about it and lectured about it, I think, fairly extensively. He says that this is a government that is trying to nationalize thought. That there is a project of nationalization of thought that is taking place. And you see it very clearly in sort of the, one nation, one language, even the idea that my religion is India. I don't even understand what the hell that means. So that whole idea of the one thing that will define all of us, that will characterize all of us, that we should all embrace, while that project sort of is underway and it makes the structures of power seem invincible, what it actually does when it interacts with something as small, as sort of menial in some sense, as vulnerable as one single young boy from the state of Gujarat, belonging to a minority community, not coming from a lot of wealth or power, but coming from a place of independent thought. When these two things collide, you suddenly see how actually insecure, vulnerable, and how easy to deflate this whole seeming power structure is. And you suddenly see why the government or why those in power are so paranoid about art, its reach, and the artist, and what the artist can be allowed to do or say or create. I think that this is something I want to sort of leave these comments with, because I think that it's very useful for us to realize not just the fact that we are vulnerable as artists, that is stating the obvious. But it is also to understand how powerful we are as artists, and the fact that we are actually vulnerable because we are powerful. And this is also something that the government is, or the people in power are discovering slowly. And again, just want to put it out there that last month there was a sort of a decision of the government that brings the OTT and the content on OTT, which is the digital platforms, into the sort of what should I say, into the control of the Ministry of INB. It's a move that has been sort of anticipated by a lot of people. And it's interesting the context in which it is happening, which is that films, as you know, in India are very heavily censored. We need a lot of clearances from government, from government various agencies for anything. Like you want to use a monkey in your film, you need an animal clearance, board, welfare board clearance. You want to use, you use any kind of particular language, the censor board will come in. You have to, there's all kinds of, there's all kinds of official and unofficial. Like, for example, if you ever show a Sikh character in a film, it's the norm, at least in Bollywood, that you have to show it to the Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, the Shiromani Gurdwara Prabandhak Committee, to get an okay from them that it's okay, we will not create a problem. That's completely unofficial. That is not a legal thing. But everyone does it, right? And I think that it's very interesting, because what happened was that the moment the OTT space opened up, and for some years it was a freer space that did not require as many governmental clearances, you suddenly began to see content that was actually engaging very fearlessly with the things that were happening around. You suddenly started seeing, mob lynchings appear in the content. You suddenly started seeing, illegal encounters everything that was happening around a certain kind of ideological, those in power clearly seem to be from a certain ideology. It suddenly started sort of looking behind the scenes on, and if you all haven't seen it, I think that Family Man is a very, very interesting sort of show to watch in this context. Patal Lok is one, Leila on Netflix is another one. And you can suddenly see that the government realized that, oh my God, we cannot allow a platform with the kind of reach that it has, because again, because of the cell phone, these platforms are so easily accessible, that we need to bring this under our control, and we need to be able to know what is happening here. And lo and behold, as of last month, the content that is going to be on OTT is going to be sort of come under the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. I don't think they haven't worked out the exact steps of what those rules will be, but it's happening. So I think that it's very, very sort of interesting to understand that the artist, and I find this very interesting, and I'll just leave it with this, that the artist in today's time, her art is both in a position of power and equally in a position of deep vulnerability, because of the kind of relationship that we all find ourselves in the world we live in today, in the context of both technology and a certain kind of trajectory that our politics and our electoral democracy has taken. So I'll stop here, and I think that I'm hoping that there will be some questions and we can discuss it further. And I'd also like to hear what you all think about some of these thoughts that I've had.
Thank you, Surag. And to hope that there will be some questions is I need to tell you there won't be some questions. There are already many questions coming in, and I'm sure it will have an interesting conversation. The first question which is here is that should art be identify its consumers? Who are the consumers of this art? Is it the state or the market? Because if it is state as an intersection between art and the market, then we can always justify censorship. And the state will decide what we should see and what we should not see. But if it is a market, then our censorship must be much lower, and we should set a very low bar. What do you think about that?
Well, I mean, I think that in terms of the consumer of art, I think that before the state and the market, it is the public, right? And with the kind of platforms that we now have, whether they are the streaming platforms, whether they are theaters, whether they are actually, I mean, theaters are now actually sort of, because of the pandemic also, they have become a space that is actually at this moment quite vulnerable. So I would actually say that before the state and the state and the market only come in because art is so easily consumable now by the public, right? The market is only interested in art because the public is now accessing it, and that's why you have this whole concept of influencers on social media, right? People who actually who get paid by brands to promote brands because their the reach of their art, and a lot of them are comics, a lot of them are sketch artists, a lot of them are people who create small bits of content, and the market is only interested in them because the public is interested in them and the public is consuming them. The state is also only interested in art because the public is consuming it, and because that kind of free interaction between the artist and the public is so dangerous to people. I mean, why else would a government be interested in what comics say? Why? And when I say government, I'm just speaking loosely of the agencies of state. So the police, for example. Why should the police, when there has been no problem to law and order, swoop in and start sort of trying to control the kind of jokes that a comic is telling, or punish a comic for jokes that he could have told? It's absolutely bizarre. So I think that the question of censorship comes in not so much in terms of whether it's the market that is consuming or the state. The question of censorship and control always comes in when the public has access to something that the state feels could become volatile. And I think that's actually what we are seeing with art. And I don't want to stress the point too much, but we must think very carefully about, again, what digital technology has done. It has made everyone is an artist. I can literally, sitting here, shoot a small film, edit it on my phone and put it out there. I can shoot content right now with my dog and my cat and my cook and my father in the house and literally create a small story, edit it and put it out there. That is the power that we have. And that is why the anxiety around art is so much. This is what I feel about this issue.
Swara, this was a brilliant talk. There is not a point which one would not agree with you. And thanks for doing that. I mean, it resonated a lot. My only question is with regard to your colleagues in the Bollywood. Now, Bollywood is one industry where no single product, no single film can ever be made without the engagement of people from all walks of life, all faiths, all religions, all beliefs. This is one institution which should have been the most worried about the current division and polarization that's happening. Why is it that there are so very few of you talking about it?
Well, quite frankly, because Bollywood is also amongst the most, precisely because it has people from all walks of life, because the projects are so wide, they employ so many people, there's so much money that is taken, and they are so vulnerable to government control, which in terms of not just, there are so many ways in which a state can harass a filmmaker if it chooses to do so at every stage of filming and then later release, whether it is, and you've seen this with sort of Padmavat, whether it is through, by not checking its fringe supporters, how fringe they are is again now a debate in terms of what happened with Padmavat, whether it was the vandalizing of the set, the beating up of the Sanjay Sir, the director, or it was the kind of protests that took place during the filming of the film and up in the run-up to its release. That's one way in which the state can, by not checking those elements and by not really doing its job. I mean, those are the people the police should be arresting. But, we had this crazy situation where there were people from the Karni Sena sitting in TV studios with talwars and saying that we will cut off Deepika's nose and we will, put a bounty on the head of the director. And it's absolutely, I mean, this is like 2018. I mean, this is the 21st century in India. So whether it's that, or it is in terms of not giving the clearances and the permissions that are required before you release a film, or it is by banning the film in different states, and that's something we have seen repeatedly in India in so many states. I mean, it's not just in Bollywood, in the South as well, where films have been banned. Even if you ban it for 3 weeks, what that does is it just renders filmmakers so vulnerable, because in those 3 weeks the film will get leaked online, pirated copies will come out, the whole economy of how a film is to recover its money can be sabotaged so easily. So filmmakers are actually very vulnerable. Stars are also actually very vulnerable, and I'm saying this as someone who does speak out, and I do sort of kind of get into various kinds of situations for that, but I don't judge those people who are not speaking out, because I understand the vulnerability that they are working with. Everyone knows our names, everyone knows our faces, pretty much everyone. It's the easiest thing to do is to find out where a hero or a heroine or an actor or an actress lives. Everyone has our numbers, everyone knows where we're shooting. So quite frankly, in a country where mob lynching is now the norm, it seems, and happens all the time, and is something that doesn't seem to bother anyone much, I don't think it's surprising why actors or actresses or people from the film industry, despite their wealth, despite their fame, feel ki yaar, I don't want to get into this. Mujhe nahi padna isme. Like, who's going to? I mean, 2 examples: Shah Rukh sir and Amir sir. I mean, the biggest superstars that this country has had, amongst the biggest superstars this country has had. One comment Shah Rukh made about intolerance. His car was stoned in Gujarat, and he couldn't shoot a song, that Zalima song from Rais, in Gujarat. They had to go to Morocco to shoot that song. One innocuous comment Amir Khan made about a private conversation his wife was having with him, completely natural as the mother to a child with a Muslim identity or a Muslim name. And Amir sir lost crores and crores worth of endorsements. I mean, he doesn't need the money, but I'm just saying. So I actually don't find it surprising that in a context where you make people feel, even people in power or in positions of influence, feel so vulnerable, why would anybody speak out? I mean, at the end of the day, filmmaking is more a business perhaps than it is an art form, because of the kind of economic investment it requires. Every good businessman will tell you that you shouldn't make your investment so risky. It's literally and I think that the question is that why have we made our society such that everything is risky? I mean, Zomato is not safe because if their driver is a Muslim, people will cancel the order. Uber is not safe, or Ola is not safe. And these are all things that have happened in the last 3 years that I'm giving you examples of. Ola is not safe because there are people who don't want a Muslim driver to drive them from one place to the other. So, I mean, what do you say about a context like this?
Correct.
There's another question here on personal conduct, Swara.
Yeah.
Should personal conduct of directors, producers, actors influence their work? And this question is directly in connection with Michael Jackson. Me and Ajay, we grew up with Michael Jackson's music, but his personal conduct was horrible as a pedophile. So should society not consume products such as this because his personal conduct has been horrible?
I mean, I think that, see, when we say personal conduct, let's be clear what we're talking about. Pedophilia is not just an issue of personal conduct; it's a crime. So, and it's not just Michael Jackson. I mean, there are so many such cases that Hollywood and the West has seen, and we just don't know in India kya ho raha hai because nobody, it's something that nobody talks about. Roman Polanski is, I think, another big director who's had repeated sort of allegations of child abuse. I think that it's. I think that when the personal conduct of an artist is something that is a crime, they must be sort of made accountable. Absolutely. And I think that then is something that will obviously be associated with their art. I mean, you can't act like, oh, that didn't happen. And I think that today, because again of the internet and Instagram, you actually see that artists have to pay the price of their personal conduct more than they did earlier, say in the time of Michael Jackson. And I can think of two very immediate names that come to my mind. One is Aziz Ansari, the comic, the Indian American comic, who was accused of, kind of sort of, I mean, it was very, of harassing a girl or making her feel uncomfortable on a date. And it was a very contested allegation, but the impact on his career was almost immediate. And it took him, I think, 2 years to sort of, clarify whatever happened, figure it out, come out of it, and so on. And this is actually an allegation that a lot of people felt was not legitimate. And the second example is Kevin Spacey, who is one, huge Hollywood star. He was the protagonist and the producer, by the way, of this very hit series called House of Cards. And in the Me Too sort of allegations came up about him being a child abuser, and the impact on his work was almost immediate, which is that he got dropped from the season, the show got cancelled, it ended very abruptly in the last season. So I think that the artist is actually a lot more accountable now, because he or she is a lot more accessible now, and in a way that is now, you can literally tag somebody, and you can tag Shah Rukh Khan and reach his phone, and you can be rest assured that he or somebody from his team is looking at it. So I think that accountability is a lot higher now. And I think I don't necessarily believe in a culture of shaming for personal conduct, but I think that when the personal conduct includes a crime, then you have to be made accountable. I mean, I don't think people should be punished for their views, but I do think that if your actions are criminal, then they should be, there is a law in this country, at least for some of us.
Swara, Shanta Sinha is asking a question. Is there a discussion amongst your peers, artists, on the current situation and the stands that you are taking? Or is all the responses at the individual level of the artist in the film industry? Is it you individually who decide? Sorry, please come. Is it you individually?
I don't think that.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sir. I think that the again, I'm only going to be speaking for the Hindi film industry, because I cannot claim to speak much about any other industry. I think that there is a discussion, of course, about what is happening. Bollywood, especially, because in the last 4-6 months, we went through that horrendous, surreal sort of drama with Sushant's unfortunate suicide, and then how that was accused of it being a murder, and these crazy stories were spun around it, and like this girl, his girlfriend was sort of victimized so much for it, went to jail for basically nothing, for a fiction that was spun by news channels for TRPs. And so, of course, there was a lot of talk about that, and Bollywood did sort of pick up the finally, in a very rare move, Bollywood actually got together, and a host of production houses filed a case against 3 news channels. So in that sense, yes, there is a discussion. But I think that a lot of the times the views that actors put out, or the positions they take, are individual choices. And there have also been cases where producers have actually told actors that, please don't comment on this. Please don't. We have a film coming out. We have something. Please don't attract any controversy to it. So that's happened as well. And I think that actually the other place where I've seen very interesting coming together of artists is in the Kerala film industry with the Women in Cinema Collective. After that case of the kidnapping and sexual assault of that actress by an actor, actually was behind it. Dileep, I think his name was, from the Malayalam film industry. There was a group of women actresses, directors, writers, technicians from the Malayalam film industry got together and created this Women in Cinema Collective, which I thought was actually quite an amazing sort of response and an effort. And they do a lot of advocacy based work on and trying to better the conditions of working conditions for women in the Malayalam film industry. So it's actually a very, very inspiring example of artists coming together to try and change what their lives are.
There's a question here. He's quoting George Eliot. He says, "Our deeds determine us as much as we determine our deeds." I was talking to a Telugu film producer, a good friend of mine, and I asked him what art is all about. And he said, art is all about exaggerated facts. And don't think that we are representing what is not happening in society, except that we exaggerate a lot. I want your comment on that.
So I'd like to thank whoever, it says Manthan India. George Eliot is one of my favorite writers. So it's nice to see a quote by her in this talk. I think that, so the question here is that as a woman public figure, what is the role you have to society, and has your profession hindered it in any way or bolstered it? I think that, I have to say that, the only reason that even my activism, so-called, I don't think I am much of an activist, but whatever it is that people feel is activisty about me, or any cause that I speak about, or my voice that is much always in some kind of trouble or the other, and in the news for various things. The only reason that anybody listens to anything I say or cares about what I say is because I'm an artist, is because I'm an actor. That is my primary identity. If I had been another person in some other job, I don't think that people would care so much about what was happening on my Twitter account or what was I saying. It is because I'm a Bollywood artist, and because Bollywood has traditionally been known for being silent on issues, that the fact that there is an artist from Bollywood who is speaking out becomes something that people are suddenly interested in hearing, or what is she saying? And this is not just true for me, this is true for so many other people. The only reason everyone is like, oh, why is Shah Rukh Khan not saying anything? Shah Rukh Khan not saying anything? Or Amir Khan not saying anything? If Amir Khan and Shah Rukh Khan have been rickshawalas, nobody's asking them what their views are about anything. But because they are artists, and they are artists that we have seen and loved, and who influence us in ways sometimes that we don't necessarily even realize, that we are interested in knowing what is their view about things. So for me, I think it has actually bolstered my voice. My identity has given me the platform to even be here. You all have called me here, not because I'm just some general activist associated with an NGO, but because I'm a Bollywood actor who has a certain other kind of identity as well. So I think my identity and my profession has bolstered my voice. Hindrance is there in the way in which that you have a cost. So yeah, there is, people, I don't necessarily get cast as much as I should, I feel, or even as much as, given the fact that most of my films, like 6 out of the 10 films, that big films that I've been associated with, are blockbuster like hits, not even super hits, they're blockbusters. But do I necessarily get the same number of mainstream offers? No, I don't. Do producers, and this is something I've heard from people within the industry, feel that, oh my God, Swara's trouble, I don't know, let's not, there'll be a controversy. Yeah, they do feel that. Has it cost me work? Yes, it has. Have I lost brand endorsements for the kind of positions I've taken? Yes, I have. I literally have a contract that says that because of your participation in the CA-NRC, I have a termination letter that says that due to your participation in CA-NRC protest, you have brought disrepute to our brand. So yeah, that is, in some sense, you want to call it a hindrance, a cost. And I'm not saying this in a way to kind of get sympathy or anything like that. I'm just telling you the facts that, yeah, there is a cost. And there is also, in some sense, you want to call it a benefit, an amplification of your voice because of the profession and the public space that I occupy. So it's both things.
Because of what you are.
Eliot was, of course, right, as you.
Because of what you are, you would be having more than your share of trolls, right? How do you handle them?
They are now part of, I've accepted it. I've accepted that I'm the most hated person, Bollywood personality on the internet. And I own it. I love it. It's part of my identity. As I said, that my trolls have actually weirdly ended up giving me, helping me more than hindering me, because what they've ended up doing is that they just keep me constantly relevant. I mean, I must be the only actor in this country who does not need a film release to be in the news. I don't need to have. It seems I don't need to be working to be relevant. I can just. I am relevant on Twitter, so it's very strange. It was very hurtful in the beginning, in the early years, and I actually, weirdly, it was 2014, the election of the Narendra Modi as Prime Minister, that began the trolling for me, because I had tweeted the day he was elected a picture, that very famous picture of the Gujarat riots, that man doing this, and I'd written something like innocuous, but also samajhne wale samajh gaye kind of thing. And of course, a lot of people got it, and people got very angry that why was I talking about the Gujarat riots at a time of such celebration. And that is actually what began the whole trolling experience for me. And initially, I used to get very upset because it was, quite personal. There was a lot of rape threats. There was a lot of death threats. A lot of it is very sexually very violent and abusive, and it's actually, I mean, as I said, it's criminal. It's harassment. It's sexual harassment online. But I've learned to deal with it. I've also understood that a lot of it is organized, a lot of it is bots, a lot of it is coming from IT cells and so on, and a lot of it is agenda driven. So now, when you understand that whole thing, and the most important thing, I'm not the only one it's happening to. I mean, it's happening to people, everyone on the internet who puts a view that is not quite in tandem with the dominant view is getting trolled. If you're a woman, you're totally getting trolled in a different way. Yes, as an actress, perhaps there is an added sort of more things that they can say about us. And, fake memes, fake news. And I will not pretend that it's not tiring. I will not pretend that it's not exhausting. The hurt and the pain and all that, I have learned to sort of develop a very thick skin to it. But I think that is also sad, because, why should women have to become inured to harassment online? We should not have to develop a thick skin to it. Absolutely. It's not right. That we do it as a survival tactic is sad. It's tragic that this is what we have to do to kind of survive on the internet. But now I've learned to make it part of my identity, and I joke about it and I celebrate it. Sometimes when it's very bad, then I have to call my lawyer and say that, should we file a criminal defamation? Because if it's something that is false, and a lot of what happens with me is that these sort of, and I'm sorry I say it so openly, but these right-wing, ecosystem, creates false fake news about you. Like, it's so easy to put your picture, an actor's photograph, do a Google search, it's everywhere. Today, everyone's photograph is everywhere because data is just so, not private anymore. So you take the photograph, you put it on a meme, and you write anything. And for 1 minute, it seems like it's true. And then you circulate it on WhatsApp, and then it just goes like, crazy viral. So yeah, I mean, those are the more serious things that you have to deal with. But for the most part of it, I've learned that it's part of the fight. So, now that I've gotten into this, now you have to just roll with the punches.
I always believe that trolling and fake news also is one advanced form of art, because they seem to be catching so many people's attention so easily. Anyway, there's just
that's actually true. Actually, that's true, sir. Sorry, just there is that. I do agree with you, because sometimes there are memes and things that are actually quite creative also, and I applaud that. Why not? Like, sure, you're.
Here we are talking about one other form of intolerance is intolerance to stand-up comedians. That's also a form of art. And why do these institutions feel so fragile that a stand-up comedian can damage their reputation?
I think
that's a form of art, and this is the institution society has created, and they should feel confident about their institutions.
Actually, because I think that that you will see that the societies where power is trying to be totalitarian, the more, I really feel that it's very funny, the more totalitarian, the more strongman, the more seemingly all-powerful that structures of power and governments and those in power project themselves to be, they actually also very quickly begin to reveal how fragile they are, how deeply insecure they are. I mean, this is a trait of these strongman leaders and these dictatorial leaders, these totalitarian leaders everywhere in the world, whether it was Stalin, whether it was Mao, whether it's Erdogan, whether it's, I mean, you know, the list goes on. That they are so, whether it was Saddam Hussein, whether it was Gaddafi, whoever, I mean, they are so deeply insecure about, you know, it's like I sometimes think of it like a hot air balloon, that it's so big and it has so much gas in it and it's expanding, it needs one pinprick for the whole thing to deflate. You need one joke about any supreme leader to remind, and I'm using a very not a very sophisticated word, I'm deliberately using a slightly crass word in Hindi, and I apologize for it already, but to remind a supreme, all-powerful political leader of his or her auqat. You need one joke. And I think that is why comics are, and have always been, that is why comics have been a source of threat to one comic, one pathetic, ill-paid, badly paid, poor, bloody, freelancer, struggling artist can actually deflate the image and the perception of the most powerful leader of your country or your land or whatever. And that is the reason why they are a source of threat to these institutions. Because actually, the more powerful an institution seems, the more it, and when I say powerful, the more it exerts its power, not based on constitutional principles, not based on rule of law, but on an arbitrary exercise of power, actually, the more insecure they are. Institutions are only strong when they function on the basis and adhere very, very strongly to rule of law, to constitutional principle, to the rules of governance. And that is something that is certainly not happening in our country at all. And that is why actually in the countries where institutions are strong, you see a culture of freedom of speech and expression. And you see the First Amendment in the USA that protects all its citizens. You see France, where again now this has become a contested space, but they really have. Europe has most Western European countries really have a sort of, you know, a commitment to freedom of speech and expression, because their institutions, to a larger extent, are, you know, at least committed to the principles that they were built on and not on an arbitrary exercise of power. Most of the institutions, I'm not don't want to get into that debate either.
I'll end my share of questions with two small points. One, where do you see hope for this country? And two, where do you think, what do we look forward to from you in terms of new films that are coming up?
Where do I see hope for this country? I see hope for this country in our young people, in our artists, in our technology, in our diversity, in our anarchy, in the fact that Indians are a hard lot to unite. We have so many internal, internal sort of issues with each other. I see hope in Amartya Sen's sort of proposition that Indians are an argumentative lot. And I think that an amalgamation of all this will save us, because I think that technology is actually, you know, why is it that India has had more internet blackouts than any other country in the world in the last 3 years? That is telling you something. That the internet is actually so powerful. There is a power, an image of a Kashmiri woman or an old Kashmiri father crying and beating his chest because he can't find his son and the son has disappeared. There is a power to that. A person sitting in Hyderabad or in Tamil Nadu or in Bombay, I saw it. That just seeing that can make us ask ourselves, you know, what are we doing? What are we doing? And why are we doing this? What is this project in Kashmir? Whatever. So I'm saying that the birth of that thought is actually something that is quite potentially dangerous for a totalitarian mentality, right? So that I think that the coming together, the confluence of technology, of creativity, of art, of our own minds, and of our diversity. I think there lies hope for us as a society. But I will say that I see the conflict increasing. I don't see it decreasing, at least in a hurry. I don't think we are headed towards a harmonious balancing of our various, differences, and we are not. We are actually headed towards a more head-on collision. I think that we will see more of the things that have happened to Munawwar Farooqi, for example, the contempt of court charges that were brought against Kunal Kamra or me or other people. I think all that is actually going to increase. It is not going to decrease, at least at this moment, because these are not. Just the combination between what is happening in our politics and what is happening in our society it's too potent right now. It's actually quite volatile right now. So that's what I see in terms of my upcoming films. I have a release. I've had a great year in the pandemic. I've had 3 releases in the pandemic.
You did, yes.
Whether it was Rasbhari and Flesh and Bhag Bini Bhag. I am actually starting off 2021 with a release on which is actually very fun. Completely, there is no great deep political thing in that. It's a fun horror comedy series, a short series on MX Player called Aapke Kamre Mein Koi Rehta Hai, which is an interesting role for me because I get possessed by a ghost in that, which is kind of funny. And then I'm shooting some more things in the coming months, and I'm also actually trying this year to produce my own film. So.
Oh, wonderful! That's wonderful. Vikram, you have anything to close, or should I?
Yeah, I think we should close there because
there's a couple of questions here which I haven't. Some of them I've addressed.
Go ahead. If you have the time.
There was one question about. There's one question about Kangana Ranaut.
Yeah.
And about you starred in the very successful Tanu as Manu with Kangana. Yeah, that was a series. There were 2 films. Today, Kangana is receiving a lot of praise and hate for her thoughts. She has highlighted some issues that most people refrain to talk about. Do you think she is using her platform in the right way? I don't think she's using her platform in the right way, because I think that while it was very laudable when Kangana was speaking about issues that pertain to more people than her own personal ambition. I think that she was very right in raising the issue, for example, of nepotism in Bollywood, of favoritism, of the experience of outsiders. But I think that very quickly deteriorated into sort of a personal agenda. And I think that what she's doing is actually quite dangerous, because she just has become now a loudspeaker for hate. And there's no other way to say this. She is just literally using her platform for hatred. And in a clever way, she always tries to link it to nationalism and to the nation and all this. But quite frankly, it is just hatred, and it is attacking people oftentimes in an illegitimate manner with fake allegations. And I don't think that is in any way that is not the same thing as having an opinion on an issue of public interest and on engaging in a civil manner with that. I'm sorry. I don't actually think that she's using her platform well at all. And I have said this quite publicly. So
one more
completely
common last one. Does the plague of nepotism in Bollywood, combined with the typecasting of roles like male audience, a false perception of communities and their role in society?
I don't know if I'm fully understanding your question correctly. Let me start by saying that there is no plague of nepotism in Bollywood. All right, it exists, but it is not as uncomplicated as some of the people who have made it their business to bash Bollywood make it seem. I'm an outsider to the industry. I have no connection in Bollywood. I literally am a person who got up, finished my MA, finished my college. The next week landed in Bombay with my bags and baggage, with this hair in Bollywood. And I am now in my 10th year of active work in Bollywood. All right. So I don't think that nepotism is a plague. Yes, there is access that your birth gives you to and a certain platforming that your birth gives you, which happens in every industry, including in the media, including anywhere in the world. I mean, if you're born into privilege, that privilege opens doors for you. That is true of Bollywood as well. But I will tell you that actually things are changing very, very fast in Bollywood. And you can see that from the number of actors who are outsiders in Bollywood. There is no plague of nepotism. Actually, a lot of casting directors and young star children say that being a star child has now become a baggage, because everyone assumes you're a terrible actor and you have to work twice. It's almost like saying that casting directors don't want to audition star children. So I think that's an interesting fallout of things. I think that, and I will say this again, that I think that the audience must also think about their own role, because, who is interested in knowing what Sridevi's daughter looks like? It's the audience. Why was her film, her debut film, made 70 plus crores, and Sushant Singh Rajput, who everyone now claims to love so much, had a release in the same year, which was a very good film, didn't do so well? Because we as an audience are more interested in knowing what Sridevi's daughter looks like and whether she dances like Sridevi than we are interested in seeing Sushant's performance. So I think that the issue is not as, I think that it does not help anyone to be simplistic about these kind of issues. I think that there's a lot of complex layers. I'm not denying that. Again, I'm not denying privilege, but I don't think there's a plague of nepotism anymore, at least. And now with the opening up of the OTT platform and so on, I think things are changing very rapidly and in a good way for talented people. Does it create a sense of a false perception? I didn't understand that second part of the typecasting of Mary Kom. See, I mean, I think what you're talking about is the casting of Mary Kom, where Priyanka played Mary Kom. And I know there was a lot of discussion about it. And I think, again, the unfortunate thing there is that you're absolutely right in saying that why was not a Northeastern actress taken, or for the role of Mary Kom? But I want to flip that question and ask ourselves: would we have watched the film if it was an unknown Northeastern actress? Would that film have been 100 crore plus hit if Priyanka had not headlined it? Would that story have been heard by as many people as heard it if Priyanka had not been on it? And I think that is the problem. The problem is not just casting. The problem is that the audience must become more open to watching non-star driven content. And that is happening now with the OTT. So I think that we are actually living at a very, it's a good time for a lot of these issues to find some kind of a good resolution.
Yeah, you said it so right, because I see a lot of films on the OTT where ordinary looking people come up with extraordinary looking performances.
Absolutely.
I mean, that wouldn't have happened even 5-10 years ago, I think. I think what I will end here, because there's questions that is flowing in. There's one of depicting of villains as Muslims, successful women are being fair. I don't think. I
mean, that kind of stereotyping is really just a reflection, as I said, that art also mirrors. I mean, it's a dialectical thing. Art mirrors society. Society gets influenced by art. So the depiction of Muslims as villains and successful women being fair are all the stereotypes of our dominant stereotypes that are coming to the fore. There's a very sweet question that I wanted. I don't have the answer for, but it's very sweet. That says, "Madam, how can we promote Iranian and Turkish movies in India?"
Oh yeah.
First, want to give a shout out to both Iranian and Turkish movies, because there's a lot of amazing content that these countries are making. I'm always especially interested in Iranian cinema because they work with so much restrictions and yet they create such beautiful content. I want to give a shout out to one of my favorite Iranian films, which is a film by Jafar Panahi called Offside. And I think that the way to promote Iranian, it's a great film. Everyone should watch it. It was set in the time when there was a ban on women entering football stadiums in Iran. And it's about a group of girls who are football fans who dress up as boys and go to watch football. Lovely film, Offside. Please watch it. I think that one of the ways to promote the cinemas of other countries in India is actually the digital platforms and the internet and the power of the internet. That We're already seeing it, that there is a show, a Turkish series, which is very popular, Ertugrul or something it's called. It's humongously popular, especially within, of course, within the Muslim communities in India, but also a lot of people have watched it, and it's actually a great show. I've seen some of the, I think it's called Ertugrul. It's a Turkish series. It's very, very well made, very good. So yeah, I think we should use the power of the internet. And thank you for this question.